Hello and welcome to this presentation on the principles of bioethics and their use in ethical decision making. This presentation was first presented in Romanian as part of a series of conference on bioethics in pandemia and the crisis of bioethics or bioethics in crisis, the anthropological understanding of the COVID-19 crisis. You are welcome to follow us, our presentation in Editura Lumen YouTube channel, and read the book associated with this presentation. The term bioethics comes from the Greek term bios, life, and that of the ethos, ethics, that is, the ethics of life. Thus, bioethics represents a particular branch of research within the wider applied ethics. Why is the study of bioethics necessary? I ask these questions to the students from the course on bioethics and professional deontology, and the answer that emerged in the dialogue with them was that at present, the human society, due to the technological advance on the one hand, but also due to the globalization, face a unique situation from the perspective of its ability to do good or to do harm. Due to its constructive or destructive capabilities, human is capable of self-destruction, but also of destroying the entire planet. The current threat posed by the coronavirus COVID-19 crisis reminds us that we are still a fragile humanity, which, although it has apparently outgrown nature through numerous technological advances, is still vulnerable to such manifestation. Nature makes human face, but the nature at the same time is vulnerable to the action of humanity. Bioethics try to answer the questions: what are or what should be the behaviors, that desirable behaviors of humanity in general, but also of each one of us, in particular in the face of situation in which each is placed due to the state of health, participation in healthcare on the one hand, but also on the development of technologies that bring with them new threats to humanity, which are in addition to the old ones that humanity seeks to diminish or eliminate. Within bioethics, the desirable responses to threats to public health, but also issues such as organ transplantation, a problem that exists since the 20th century, when such transplants have been performed, are addressed in a prescriptive manner, discussing the time when organs can be harvested, in correlation with the idea of brain death, which appear as another definition of death, precisely to be able to perform such transplants, and which appears correlative with the idea of death as it was understood so far, the cardiorespiratory one, the definitive cardiorespiratory stop. Cerebral deaths represent the termination without the possibility of recovering the function of the upper nervous system, and which is practically irreversible, which allows the harvesting of organ, hearts, kidneys to be donated to people on waiting list of transplantation, and thus save human lives. Together with the students, we found that in the literature there are a number of ideas regarding the acceptability of the idea of brain death as the limit of life, for and against arguments regarding the possible medical fault, the risk of malpractice, but also approaches with possible criminal intention of a deep coma labeled as brain death for a faster organ harvesting. In the context of those discourses, I saw that organ transplantation is a benefit to the recipient, and that organ donation after death could be a good way of doing good for the donor. Starting from here, we can consider the principles of bioethics, which were first formulated by Beauchamp and Childers, the principle of charity or beneficence, the principle of any action in the medical system is to do good, correlated with that of not doing evil or non-maleficence. This second principle originated from the Hippocratic Oath, which first requires the physicians to refrain from doing harm through his medical practice. By this principle of non-injury is meant the abstention from any willful evil, whether we speak, for example, of the use of weapons of mass destruction based on pathogen or inhuman, degrading and torture method in the camps, or of the prisoners in experiment on human subjects, as was in the case, for example, in the experiment of Dr. Mengele carried out in the Auschwitz concentration camp during the Second World War. Within the same principle of non-harm, the scientific literature sometimes includes therapeutic treatment, the situation in which the therapy is continued in the certain incurable disease beyond the limits, where there are chance of healing or improvement, or which puts the patient in unnecessary stress situation or even in degrading or humiliating situations. Some patients may find that a temporary unpleasant condition is a necessary evil, and then there must be a balance between beneficence and non-maleficence. Unpleasant situations that may occur in the current period, the crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic, when people who do not show any symptoms of the disease, and also we are not tested positive for coronavirus, and however placed in isolation at home or even quarantined in if they have come from areas at high risk of coronavirus infection. This approach to quarantine as a specific response to threats to public health can be interpreted from the point of view of individuals in quarantine, but also of those in self-isolation and who have not had contact with people infected with the virus in questions, as personal harm but necessary for public health, thus responding to the requirement of public good. A third principle discussed is that of respect for the autonomy of the individual, the patient, the person. This principle stems from the idea expressed by Immanuel Kant, namely that the human person is and should always be treated as a purpose and not as a means, as such should be at the center of any actions and any policies, including those of health. Respect for the decision of person is especially important when the society focuses on humanism with the aims of creating a society as humans as possible in general. The principle of the categorical imperative formulated by Immanuel Kant is it acts only according to the maximum by which you can at the same time want it to become a universal law, which shows that needs to make of its own moral law a law that can be applied to all humanity. Philosopher Immanuel Kant discusses so-called golden rule: behave with others as you would like them to behave with you. The principle of respect for the autonomy of the person, derived from Kant's work, it is transposed into the current medical ethics through the necessity of informed consent, although it involves much more than that. The idea of informed consent represents the right of the patient to know what his or her health condition is and to decide knowingly on the treatment he is subject to. Any experiments or any other forms of research on human subjects he participates in, to have guaranteed the right to decide at any time to withdraw from treatment or medical research or any other form of research that concerns one's health or well-being. The principle of respect for autonomy is not just an ethical principle in biomedical research, but in any form of research that involves human subjects in general, be it psychological, psychosocial, social assistance, and even sociology, and as long as the experimental condition affect the normal way of functioning of the individual. The most drastic effect on the health of the well-being in the various research or interventions are those in which elements related to the health of the person are concerned. The current condition imposed by the perspective of public health make the observance of the principle to be limited, focusing on the need for health security of the citizen and the public good to limit the risk of illness. The perspective of the priority of the public good leads to decisions of health policies that impose large-scale quarantine, border closures, thus limiting the right of free circulation even within the European Union. Thus, the limits of the decision between the rights to self-determination, autonomy, and public good represent such an ethical dilemma with which the whole world is confronted today at an unprecedented level for the postmodern society. Starting from the analysis of the ethical dilemmas involved by possible conflicts between the principles, the problem of euthanasia can be discussed as an expression of the person's autonomy in the context of ending of life on request and, respectively, the abstention from doing harm that is requested to the doctor by both the second principle of bioethics as well as the Hippocrates oath. In this context, the decision of a court in Germany that the right to euthanasia should not be correlated only with a particularly serious state of health, irreversible, with a negative prognosis regarding the possibility of surviving more than 3 or 6 months, and that the right to life is correlative with the right to renounce it in the form of euthanasia or assisted suicide. The topic of euthanasia is the subject of extensive debates in the public space, legal, medical, ethical, but also artistic. Such talk about the acceptability of assisted suicide and euthanasia was the subject of the movie Me Before You in 2016, produced by Karen Rosenfeld and Alison Owen, who presented the situation of a particularly active young man, sportive, with a tumultuous life, a rich young man with great financial resources, but who, following an accident, suffered from spastic tetraplegia, with particularly great pain, having reserved recovery forecast with close to zero chance of healing. The family hires a young woman to take care of him, and during the process of care, the two develop an emotional relationship. The young man decides to carry out his intention to be euthanized and to end his life. The idea expressed by the young man is that although life can continue under those conditions, that is not the life he wants, it is not his life. In addition to the right to autonomy, starting from the analysis of the film, one can also discuss the right to dignity. During the discussions with the students on this topic, the principle of Christian morality were invoked, which prohibits suicide in any situation, starting a debate on the actuality of euthanasia and its ethical acceptability, given the euthanasia is still incriminated in Romania. Another topic brought to the students' attention was that of abortion as an important bioethical issue that generates a dilemma, choice between the right of the unborn to life and that of the woman to decide on her own body and what happens in it. From a Christian bioethics perspective, abortion, like euthanasia, is unacceptable throughout, although unlike euthanasia, abortion is legal in Romania and in many more states than those in which euthanasia is legal. The decision on abortion prevails the right of the woman to decide on her own body, her own organism, that is, her autonomy, at the expense of the right of a still unborn person, that is to say, of a being to whom the right to be a person and implicitly the right to dignity is not recognized. In the scientific literature, there was a discussions about the acceptability of the infanticide renamed as postnatal abortion, and concerns the right of a family to request euthanasia for children born with particularly serious malformations and whose life prognosis is limited. The author on the controversial hypothesis, who pointed out that if abortion is acceptable based on the fact that in the absence of self-awareness, aborted future fetuses do not have a legitimate interest in life, since they do not have the consciousness of losing it, the same argument should be in favor of euthanizing newborns. It would be proceeded as it did in the old Sparta, where children who were born with malformation were killed. The main argument was that the situation of the newborn children is not much different from the perspective of awarenesses of their own interest in living of the newborns to that of the aborted fetuses. In neither case is self-awareness present, and apparently it is the awareness of the imminent death. As such, the mere fact of being born should not confer additional rights on newborns, as long as the right to life is presumed to derive from a self-awareness that they do not have yet. It can be considered that, from the perspective of the right to life, there is a situation of inequity between observing it in the case of newborn children, even if it is born with severe malformation, including cerebral palsy or other severe infirmities, which limited life prognosis, and with the prospect of chronic pain states, compared to aborted fetuses who could be viable persons and could be born in perfectly healthy conditions. By accepting abortion but rejecting the euthanasia of newborn babies, the society discriminated based on the criteria of time of birth. The above-mentioned article discusses the acceptability of euthanasia and abortion alike. Starting from the idea of inequity in the protection of the right to life, one can open the discussion of inequity in the general, and from here to the fourth principle of bioethics, that of social equity or justice is brought into questions. In healthcare, there are often issues related to respect for social justice and fairness. Why do such problems arise? Because the society does not have the capacity to ensure access to health equality and according to the needs of each person. In Italy, during the outbreak of coronavirus infection, there is an extremely severe triage regarding people who are put on artificial ventilation, people suffering from this infection, manifested by severe acute respiratory symptoms, and in a lack of sufficient beds in intensive care, triage is required, which people receive and who do not receive artificial respiration, who are practically worthy and who are not guaranteed the right to health and life, and which are the criteria by which we can ethically restrict the right to life on a person, knowing that by not entering intensive care there is a major risk of death. It is known from the unfortunate experience of those in China that the population at higher risk of death from this coronavirus is related to older age and comorbidities. The decision taken by the Italian health authorities at the level of the hospitals in the most affected area is to introduce young people in intensive care with a life expectancy and health chances greater than that of the elderly. Thus, discrimination on the basis of age appears in the provision of the health services, life-saving services, which we understand to be inequity in health. Such inequity of a major can occur in many situations, for example within national health program, such as the National Diabetes Program and the National Oncological Program, and so on. Unfortunately, not all particularly serious illness that may have a negative prognosis, which may endanger the lives of individuals, benefit from such national health programs, precisely because the national health system cannot practically guarantee equal access to health for all patients, and above all, it cannot ensure access to health according to real needs of all patients. Some health systems are better developed than others, and from here inequalities may appear either geographically or politically or state-wise, depending on the political system and the level of development of the respective countries. The right to health is universal, and states should make every effort to ensure it. However, it is very clear that the right to health cannot be fulfilled under optimal conditions for all patients and under any conditions. The possibility of innovative treatment and access to particularly expensive therapies can be discussed here, which are often limited depending on the person's ability to contribute additionally to the health insurance that he voluntarily paid or was withheld ex officio from the incomes that she has according to the law governing the public health system and the health insurance in one country or another. In the first part of the lecture, the four principles of bioethics were discussed with the aims of exemplifying them in various concrete situations in order for the audience to become acquainted with the specificity of bioethical discourse and ethical principles, as well as with its application in ethical decisions in specific situations. In what follows during the lecture, the answers to a series of questions from the participants to the virtual lecture through the Facebook page were integrated. A fourth opinion comes from a virtual learner. The topic of abortion is interesting. I believe, however, that there are many endless discussions in this area, both from a bioethical and religious point of view. Indeed, we believe that abortion is a problem that has aroused and still aroused endless discussions because it is unacceptable from a religious ethics point of view and is unacceptable to many people also bioethically in a humanistic bioethics. Many authors who, although not writing in a Christian way, are ultimately inspired by Christian ethical values, values that they transfer in the bioethical space. The abortion issue is a public policy issue. In Romania, abortion was forbidden during the communist totalitarian regime in an extremely way, which resulted in a high number of victims among women who made illegal abortions. In this sense, you can watch the movie 9.5 Weeks, screenwriters Sarah Kernonian and so on, a film that raised precisely the issue of illegal abortions in communist Romania, where there was a total restriction of abortion, even when the mother's serious health reason would have recommended. The public policy approach can itself be catalogued under the risk of violating the principle of non-maleficence, as long as an absurd refusal by the state and sometimes doctors to accept abortion in strictly determined medical situation leads to the death of both the mother and the child, practically to the destruction of two lives, when at least one of them could have been saved. Except for this particular situation, the discussions is in the form of a choice between a subjective rights of the mother to self-determination and that of an unborn child. Many female people say the child at a young age is not just a blessing, as it is for most, but a curse because a child limits your career options, marital freedom, and so on, and that is relinquished to abandoning the child to maternity and giving it for adoptions, and there are unfortunate situations of the cases of children simply being thrown away in the dumpster. Some of these children abandoned at the birth survived were included in the child protection system, while others dies. And they died in the far more tragic condition and with a far more serious violation of the person's dignity than if they had died as a result of an abortion. The situation is one that imposes criminal sanctions. Infanticide is a crime, and if the perpetrators were detected by the investigator body, they were penalized, but that did not necessarily discourage such facts. Starting from this argument, people who consider abortion acceptable says that giving birth to a child but abandoning it, even if the maternity hospital, but especially under the condition described above, is in fact a condemnation of that child into suffering, to the limitation of his right to life, the right to happiness, and so on. Opponents of this point of view believe that regardless of the condition in which an individual's life unfolds, the right to live prevails before the mother's particular interest, and then being born and living in better than not living at all. Of course, the two views are in competition. There is a bioethical dilemma that we do not intend to solve as such. The role of this lecture is not to solve bioethics problem, and not even to say this is the correct ethical solution, because the dilemmas do not have a correct and final ethical solutions acceptable to everyone. They have only points of view to which each of us adhere. It is important to adhere to the cause informed and documented. Important for those lectures is to learn together to pose ethical issues and to acknowledge the ethical dilemma, their importance due in today's society. Another opinion from another virtual participant in the lecture says, I think we have to take into account the medical condition of the mother regarding abortion. I personally knew the case of an acquaintance that had serious heart issues and I had to give up the pregnancy. This issue of abortion should be clarified taking into account several aspects: biomedical, bioethical, religious and social. I will respond to this suggestion through a personal confession. At the time of my birth, my mother had an express indication of abortion, and this happened during Ceausescu's time, that is 47 years ago, exactly during the time of the abortion was banned, except in extremely serious health situation. My mother had a clear indication of abortion at the time, and yet her autonomy made me be here today with you. This argument is intended to be in favor of the woman's right to decide, including taking health risk in favor of life. Despite the abortion recommendations and the clear specifications that only one of the lives can be saved, either of the mother or the child, my mother left this world only last year. Another issue is based on the opinion of a student who draws our attention that euthanasia is not legal in Romania, but what do we do with those who want while in terminal stage because of the terrible pains that no longer give in to morphine? As states in the first part of the presentation, the problem of euthanasia must be approached from many angles, being a very complex one. We can consider that the right to finitude of life is one that should be correlative with the right to life. And when the pain is extremely strong, it does not give into strong painkillers such as morphine, but not only. In this situation, the person should decide when and under what condition he can give up on his own life. We can question the fact that there are limits to this right. Here is a case of euthanasia that was approved a few years ago of a person with severe depression, of a young woman who decides that life is not worth living for her, and that is a burden because of her mental health depression and not due to an organic condition and unbearable pain of physical nature. Eventually, she was allowed euthanasia by a court decision and on the basis of opinion, including from ethical committees, on the ground of mental health and not of incurable somatic disease. As far as I know, it is only case until now when euthanasia was accepted in a mental health case. Accepting the euthanasia of people suffering from mental illnesses, as is the case of the person presented above, open up a series of delicate problems because, for example, many teenagers facing the first failure in love can say, I do not want to live anymore, I do not deserve to live anymore, my life has ended with the separation of the first love, or even in the case of adults after leaving a long-term couple relationship. The person may no longer see the meaning of life, easily appearing to euthanasia due to severe depression caused by the losses in his life. Even without considering the opinion of euthanasia, many people resort to suicide when they suffer from depression, which would mean that the society would grant them the right to assisted suicide and ease their terminal gesture. The society must have practical decision-making tool, that is, when autonomy is to be respected with regard to end of life, and when society should intervene prohibiting the assisted suicide or euthanasia. Suicide cannot be prevented in any situation, but when we are close to a person who is in the process of committing suicide, we should intervene to save that person's life. From a religion's point of view, euthanasia is unacceptable because life itself is sacred. From the same reason, abortion is not acceptable either. The sacredness of life is practically the argument that rejects any form of counter-argument related to the right to euthanasia. As long as in the Christian religion it states that the Savior Jesus Christ, suffering the terrible agony for the salvation of the people, Resorting the euthanasia to lessen their suffering cannot be an argument valid for Christians who focus on following the example of Jesus Christ in the form of imitatio Christi, and this should be an example in accepting one's own suffering. On the other hand, there are people who cannot assume and cannot accept without limitation the suffering, and then that the end of this suffering, even if it not acceptable from the Christian and general religious point of view, from the civil point of view, could be at right. Personally, I would accept the individual's right to self-determination regarding euthanasia, but only in very justified situation when both the specialist doctors and an ethics committee certify the irreversible character of the disease and the adverse prognosis. I am happy that I am not in a position to be in an ethics committee that would make such a decision to accept or refuse euthanasia. However, we were discussing other situation of euthanasia, namely so-called passive euthanasia, the disconnection from device in situation where life is inappropriate to continue, sometimes also called as refusing to practice therapeutic hardening. For example, Israel is a state where device decoupling is prohibited. In this situation, it is possible to analyze the case of a hospital in which the intensive care clinics is completely occupied by people in a vegetative state with a prognosis of zero resuscitation, but which cannot be disconnected from the device. When that hospital, it is necessary to hospitalize a new patient who has chance of recovery, but there are no place, and the hospital must refuse his admission because there is nowhere to put him. We are discussing a more or less hypothetical situation, but unfortunately the situation is similar today in Italy, when the triage of patients suffering from coronavirus infection imposes the decision of the artificial ventilation of a patient, whether or not there is a risk of death, the respective doctor being put to choose in the end who lives and who does not. And the problem we consider as life and death situations are actually current problems that healthcare professionals face and to which bioethics must allow an immediate response. This makes the medical ethics a little different from the ethics of everyday life. It is the ethics of what we sometimes call the ethics of extreme situation. It is the ethics of situations where both opinion can have negative consequences. In bioethics, we try to formulate such problem in such a way that there are decision-making tools. Bioethical principlism, that four principles I spoke of, formulated by Beauchamp and Childress, aim to be such an instrument of ethical decisions, of decision by which the individual, the physicians, the therapists decide on an intervention, on an experiment, to a practice in general, it is beneficial or not. To whom and when, to what extent does it hurt, can it bring harm, when, how, and what are the limits of this harm, what are the advantage and disadvantage, in what way and how is the dignity of the person respected, and especially his right to self-determination and autonomy. Does the person's right to autonomy violate another person's right to life, health? To what extent can the right to autonomy be restricted, and under what conditions? And is the therapy, this intervention, a fair one? Is access provided to so that as many people as possible benefit? The bioethicist Julian Savulescu raised a series of problems related to the possibility that humanity may not be adapted to the future condition, especially following the development of medical technologies. He introduced the idea of moral bioenhancements, emphasizing problems that current ethics also rise, namely precisely these dilemmas of principles and how they will be solved in a future society. We believe that if the current crisis in public health caused by the widespread of coronavirus will not completely change the path of the future society, we will live in a society where technology is advancing, where life expectancy is increasing, while also facing the risk of the emergence of new pathogens, even though many of the traditional pathogens have been eliminated. At this point, another problem raised by the current society, and which has now received an answer from the bioethical perspective, is the ethical and social acceptability or unacceptability of mandatory vaccination, which is again the subject of discussions in the Romanian Parliament during this period. Mandatory vaccination reduced polio and other diseases that have decimated the entire population for decades. Antibiotics decreased mortality due to bacterial infections. Antiviral vaccines have appeared. Even total cure treatment for HIV/AIDS have appeared here. The medicine makes amazing progress. The intensive therapy and artificial ventilation appear, which allows the saving of many lives. Their prolongation, various forms of transplantation have occurred. A number of other technologies are emerging that will lead to what we have called anthropological uniqueness, anthropological singularity. The term anthropological singularity is somewhat correlative with the idea of technological singularity. Technological singularity has been defined as a situation where artificial intelligence becomes more complex, or at least at the same level of complexity as human intelligence. Currently, supercomputers exceed human intelligence. Here are a number of ethical dangers and risks, and technoethics is a branch of applied ethics, complementary to bioethics because it's designed to change the technology, including medical ones, experienced in the course of human life. There are a number of risks that technological development, such as artificial intelligence, but also biomedical technologies, can bring. The increase of social inequalities because such techniques and therapies that extend the life indefinitely lifespan are not accessible to all, but only to those who benefit from a certain material prosperity. There is a whole literature on the fact that research is carried out on the indefinite extension of life, and we approach immortality either through continuous transplant from one body to another, or through the transfer of consciousness into robotic body, or even the digitalization of consciousness. As long as it is not yet clear whether we will be able to transfer consciousness from one body to another, physical, biophysical or digital, one respectively, we are not yet sure that such a transplant will be possible in the near future, but there are already inventions that allow neurons to communicate with artificial neurons. In practice, such a transfer of mental content of consciousness to another body, be it biological or computer-made, can be thought in a sense of not necessarily obtaining immortality, but a very large extension of life expectancy. And then, who will be the one who will benefit from such as the extension of life? Will all the inhabitants of the planet be? If so, it is necessary for humanity to quickly enter another stage of its existence, namely cosmo-humanity. We should populate other vital space in the cosmos because the planet will not be able to exceed a certain volume of population, as there will be no resources to support population growth through numerous births under the indefinite growth of life expectancy. But it's predictable that of such life extension technology will benefit the rich people first and foremost. And then financial inequality will transfer to inequality related to the exercise of the right to life. Other technology besides those aimed at increasing life expectancy are those aimed at moral bioenhancement. Humanity, due to current scientific and technological developments, has the possibility of inducing through pharmacological or genetic ways the creation of seemingly better moral individuals, for example, by inhibiting a particular gene which generates aggression. By inhibiting the aggressive of the person, he or she will be more docile, less prone to conflict, and at the level of society there will be fewer immoral decisions, fewer criminal acts. A person who is genetically determined to have an increased level of fear through hormonal imbalance or by altering the activity of some neurotransmitters can reach a situation where they are extremely docile, not because their own moral conscience, autonomy dictates it, but because it was biologically modified. By opposition, those universal soldiers can be created who feel less or no pain, but implicitly feel less or no feelings toward other people, toward their own personal, and can kill without remorse, without such blockage on a moral or emotional level. Julian Savulescu sets an example in one of his works, a community in which all persons are deaf and where our person who is deaf will be excluded or at least marginalized. A person who is not deaf will be excluded. Excellence is also marginalized in our society today in general. The idea of marginalization different people, even if apparently is a superior way, it is not a new one. Ioan Petruculian was talking about the idea of beating fly. What does this idea mean? There is talk of an experiment in a tropical area where the fly cannot survive because they are very powerful predator that catch them in fly and that do not allow to the development of flying insects. Through a genetic accident, a certain species develop European fly, but adapted to the respective region, which have no wings and cannot fly, and no longer vulnerable to airborne predators. Natural selection allows these insects to survive, but as terrestrial insects that do not fly. They are basically another species. Petruculian explained in this example, starting from the theory of natural selection, that we know as Darwin's theory, the development of modern Western society in which the people who during the Renaissance had scientific concerns, although pursued by the Inquisition, transformed society through science, this evolving into what we now call a knowledge-based society. Another suggestion from the students called for the deepening of the bioethical perspective on the values and the impact of the traditional values of the society on the various issues previously considered. You could discuss the moral values theory from the perspective of the national culture related to the fields of bioethics, more precisely a comparison between how the old values are compared to their current importance. Every society, every nation has a number of moral values. I conducted a comprehensive study on these values of ethics in today's Romanian society. A study I published in the Journal of the Study of Religion and Ideology together with Alexandra Huidu and Ana Frunze. Also, a larger presentation of this study is available at the library of Center for Applied Ethics on Stefan cel Mare University, Java, in which the study was developed. The issue of national values in the current context is analyzed by us from the perspective of the impact of these values and their reception in the current context. The obtained results show that the values of the citizens of the Romanian northeastern region are the religious inspiration, more especially from Christian Orthodox. The Orthodox Christian tradition emphasizes asceticism, the communion with the divinity, and what access to deification means to be the grace of God by His will and by your work as much as possible to lift yourself up to the state in which you are as a human being to a condition that transcends the condition of worldly creation toward a divine ontological condition. This communication, this human intimacy with God, makes bioethical values to be together in the sense that suffering is necessary because suffering humbles, diminish pride, diminish self-love, and that suffering can draw you closer to divinity. Euthanasia, like other problems constantly in the attention of bioethicists researchers, is approached from a Christian perspective in a sense of acceptance to your cross, that is the condition of health among others, because it is allowed by God even if it is not His will to suffer. Suffering is seen as an attempt that you must face and which is useful for your spiritual growth. The idea of acceptance suffering as an everyday element of life is not a new idea. It is also appearing in other cultural space, from Catholic to the Far East. The contemporary postmodern society is one that runs away from pain, but also from assuming liability and responsibility. We are talking about a minimalist ethic, an ethic in the twilight of death, an ethic in which people are rather selfish and individualistic. We see such a selfish ethic in the current situation of the pandemic, in which people who are not necessarily infected by suspicious, especially who came from risky area and who are placed in self-isolation and home, go out and walk on the street without being responsible for the possibility of infecting others. The post-industrial society, the postmodern society, places great emphasis on individualism, on the individual, on his ego, and especially on the fact that he must feel good. It is a consumer society, and the value of consumerism are the values of flashing good, of the immediate good. They are called surrogacy. But they are surrogates of life, equity, justice, and so on, which make us imagine a society as prosperous as possible, as prosperity and not development, spiritual or other nature is the central value of today's society. And then this prosperity, thus rush for wealth, leads to the idea of bypassing not only evil but also the idea of the evil can exist. Today I was getting a message from a colleague, Professor Bogdan Popoveniuk, who showed that even videos that show painful but contemporary scenes, worse scenes, for example of scenes with malnutrition children, are not necessarily censored, but they do get a tag on YouTube stating that this video may contain disturbing scenes. Yes, but those disturbing scenes are real. They are filmed in the theater of operation, in disaster area, in area affected by hunger, extreme poverty, and those images were used to illustrate the famous music of one of the Beatles band member. At the moment, although this clip is known, it receives a level that image may disturb. If we are so easily troubled by the fact that such reality still exists on our planet, we will not easily accept the fact that an epidemic, here a pandemic, because since yesterday the coronavirus turned into a pandemic, the fact that a pandemic situation must disrupt communication or at least freedom of movement, the fact that here some countries, as in the case of Hungary, has closed the border within the European Union, and there are endless questions of and the question of cars of the western border of Romania, especially from Italy to Romania, which cannot transit Hungary, that the United States have cancelled flights to Europe, the fact that Romania has limited the flights to Italy, or the fact that being a Romanian citizen coming from red zone with risk of infection, you must undergo quarantine of compulsory self-isolation. The presentation was first present in March, in the date the pandemic was declared by the WHO. These things are no longer accepted as normal. The borders were closed. For example, during the communist period, the Romanian citizens could not only travel to Western Europe with special approvals, and then it is difficult for us to see that the world is good, that the world is wonderful, although we cannot, we knew it is not. We can discuss a legend in India about what Gautama Siddhartha, the future Buddha, is supposed to have lived. He was born in a royal family. He was a prince, because a number of prophets said that he would detach himself from his family, his parents, his country, and become an ascetic. The king decides to keep him from seeing death and suffering and old age. It seems that his destiny makes him at one point, leaving the princely castle, meet an old man and suffering peasant and a corpse. He wonders that these are because he had never seen death and suffering. He had previously lived only in luxury and life and pleasure of well-being, but what are those situations which are totally unpleasant? And the future Buddha finds out from someone in the entourage, whom legend believed to be a divinity, that there is a death in the world, that there is suffering, that there is old age, decay, and that not even everyone lives in princely place, that not everyone has access to welfare only. These things sadden him and frightening him so much that he wants to achieve a special state of consciousness. And he lives, goes through all kinds of assets, finally decides to sit under a tree, becoming in history the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment, and to say that he will not rise from there until when he will obtain a state of consciousness that transcends this world and its limitation, disease, suffering, and death. Legend has it that on the 14th day Gautama Siddhartha become a Buddha, that is, the enlightened one, who transcends both illness and suffering, not because the disease and the suffering would not physically touch him, and that the physical death would not touch him anymore, but because his level of consciousness become above the disease, the suffering, and this idea of the disease, of the suffering, no longer disturbs his tranquility and inner peace. Maybe more of us are now in the situation of becoming so transcendental, of having a forced transcendence due to this encounter with the coronavirus. And if we are not necessarily at the level of Gautama Siddhartha to become a Buddha, we may nevertheless become a little wiser. Artificial transcendence in those of our century, and we discuss here another work in the Noari Harari Homo Deus, starting from the idea that humanity has reached another ontological condition that, at least for our ancestors, is positions us in the situation of not being human anymore, but of being another species, one of gods, for example, or Buddhas. It is known that people cannot fly. I can't fly now because flights have been banned, but in the last few days they have been flying for hundreds of years. People have been flying and moving from one side of the globe to another. With humans, of course, viruses flies as well, but that's another discussion. If the pandemic had occurred in the 19th or 17th century, it would probably have done so far about the same number of causalities as the plague. Thus, however, the measure known by humanity, including mechanical ventilation, intensive care, and so on, reduce the risk of death. We are not yet in a position to be immortal like the gods, but we have a longer life, and maybe it is a joke that say that the new generation, the new greeting after the end of the epidemic will be the Vulcanian one, live long and prosper. The greeting is taken from the Star Trek movie series. In the Bible, at one point, God asked or addressed something similar to man, who creates the sun, the moon, the stars. And now, of course, we will continue to say that God created them, but if we read the process carefully, we will say that here a particle accelerator in China has recreated the temperature condition of the sun. So surely a Chinese, more or less communist, could answer, the Chinese created Lord the sun. But the moon, well, the Russian with the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, was the first satellite in the first artificial moon on Earth. Here we have the sun, not so great, but existing on Earth, particular accelerator, Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. We have artificial moon satellites that are used today in telecommunication, GPS, including military application. We have artificial star. We have such technologies that allow me to be with you virtually, even if the school has cancelled the phase of the course, and we still feel in a dialogue, and I will answer questions and you will see me. Originally this presentation was in academic context. Basically, we are virtualizing the space. We are in a situation where the interaction between us are now virtual. The distance are no longer a problem. We are in a virtual ubiquity. Here is another characteristic of transcendence, the ubiquity to be at the same time anywhere. And here I am at my house, at my home, and at the same time in your homes, and talking about virtual ubiquity as something completely natural. Is this ethical? Is this moral issue? Following are a series of other questions and ideas from the participants' one's lecture. In a society in which there is diversity and the principles of life differ from man to man, the values system being influenced by the level of education and social status, can we talk about fair decision making tools on bioethics? We will not have fair decision for each individual. We will have acceptable decision. Bioethic, at least the principled one that came from Beauchamp and Childress, we understand it as a decision system based on a social acceptability rather. It replaced the idea of ethicist with lay persons, lay people, ordinary people. Ethics in general has been, at least as Aristotle says, has shown us a guide to good conduct. The first known book on ethics in Europe is that of Aristotle, who is guided, it is about Staggerit's teachings to his own son Nicomach. Traditionally, it is considered that an ethicist, a specialist, can tell everyone what is good and what is bad in society, and society should follow this idea. Religious ethics impose a number of principles: the Decalogue, the Code of Hammurabi, the Manavara Dharma Shastra. In a various spiritual tradition are such mandatory ethical codes to be followed by the followers of the respective religion or spirituality. In general, ethics is related to codes. That's why it should be. today's ethics tends to encode behaviors. When we talk about social and ethical acceptability, we refer to the way in which the dominant values at the society level are perceived. Acceptability is based on consensus of majority. It is the principle of democracy in ethics. An acceptable decision is considered by most members of the respective community. In opposition to the acceptability, we have the desirability, which means the highest standards considered to be desirable by most members of the respective interpretative community. In opposition to the deliberative ethics discussed above, which is based on social consensus, modern ethics is also an imperative ethics. Kant speaks of the categorical imperative. The imperative ethics says it must happen regardless of the will of the majority because it is right, because the ethical experts know how it is best. In bioethics, we also have currents that favor the idea of ethical expertise. The Principles of Ethics, the most widely used in bioethics, the one with which I started this lecture, is based on the idea of democratic ethics, of ethics based on the acceptability of the majority. Therefore, the problem of abortion, euthanasia, and so on are treated in the sense that they are acceptable by a large or small majority. Of course, these principles are moderated with respect for human rights and respect for the dignity of the person. But, in principle, bioethical acceptability is related to social acceptability and has a quasi-democratic character. When we conduct the study on ethical values, those published in the Journal for the Study of Religion and Ideology, we showed that the ethical reflection that most individuals have is limited, that is particularly low. In general, we do not face ethical problems unless they arise in the form of dilemma that demand immediate solution, and then it is quite late to make long-term decisions for which there is a consensus at the society level. In general, I use ethical analysis from the theory of communicative action. The term communicative action comes from Jürgen Habermas. Communicative action is the kind of social action aimed at obtaining a public consensus. Not all public policy can be based on consensus and decision-making transparency. In our case, we believe that a short-term public consensus on health policy decisions, such as those aimed at legitimate public activity and closing schools, cannot be reached. There is no consensus on this decision because at the present there are many parents who have great problems overseeing their child who are at home due to the disruption of school and kindergarten, the parents having no one to leave home when they have to be at work. This requires special measure, work from home, special leave for children care, and so on. However, in this situation, the imperative character of it is necessary. Otherwise, ethical decision should also have a democratic basis. I personally am a follower of the idea of bioethics that combine the idea of ethical expertise of imperative normative type with the democratic ethics of a decision based on communicative action. Thank you very much for listening this presentation, and have a wonderful day. Be with us on the YouTube channel Editura Lumen, and you could hear more presentation on this topic, on bioethical topic, on ethics, and so on, philosophical practice, sociology, and so on. Thank you very much.